Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Yi Sung, who I'm reading out of Three Poets of Modern Korea. So Yi Sung was a sort of modernist, Dadaist, surrealist type poet. He wrote primarily in the 1930s, the early portion of the 30s especially, and he actually died quite young. He died in 1937 after being released from a Japanese detention facility in Japanese-occupied Korea. Well, he was I think he was arrested in Korea, transported to Japan, and he died in Tokyo. I think he started writing in the late 20s, early 30s. And he was very much influenced by, again, the surrealist poets, the Dadaists, people like this. And ironically enough, this influence kind of came from, it got sort of filtered through Japan, but also through French literature, which was another sort of major literary player in East Asia at the time because of French colonialism in Southeast Asia. So his poems definitely challenged the Korean literary establishment, which was much more traditionalist in the way that it sort of preferred poems. And this is one of the things, is Korea is this fascinating culture that in many ways is extraordinarily traditionalist, in part because their culture has always been on the fringes of Chinese and Japanese culture, as well as, to a lesser extent, sort of Eastern Russian culture. And so in many aspects, Korea has been quite a conservative country culturally. And so when someone like Yi Sung comes along and is basically doing something completely new, completely experimental, it was a shock to the system. And yet, he became this sort of fascinating, beloved poet whose work began to sort of resonate, particularly with people who were not entirely comfortable with the traditional order. So this collection includes basically two standalone poems and then a number of poems from the collection Crow's Eye View. There's about, let's see, I think 15? Yeah, there's 15 poems from Crow's Eye View included here. So these ones that are poem number, whatever it is, those are from the Crow's Eye View series. So I'm going to read you a couple of these. So you get a sense of the sort of experimental, surrealist, Dadaist style that you brought. So poem number 3. The person fighting is namely the person who is not fighting, and the person who is fighting is also the one who does not fight. And if the case should arise that the person who is fighting wants to watch some fighting, it hardly matters if the person not fighting watches the fighting, or if the person who does not fight watches the fighting, or if the person who wasn't fighting or the person who does not fight watches the absence of fighting. So these are the sort of, there's this sort of fascination in many of the poems with this sort of circularity of ideas, this sort of spiraling of a particular image or idea, theme, thought, something like this. It's almost, in a way, it's almost like a record is stuck in a particular groove, but each time the record spins, it varies slightly what's going on. It's an interesting approach, and again, it is very much in this sort of surrealist, Dadaist style. The next one I'm going to read you is called Poem Number 9, Gun Barrel. Every day a hot wind blows in, and at last a large hand reaches around my waist. As soon as the smell of my sweat has filled the ravines of the hand's fingerprints, shoot, I will shoot. I feel the weight of a gun barrel in my stomach, the muzzle sliding up against the back of my teeth. When I close my eyes as if ready for the rifle's blast, what was it that I spit out instead of a bullet? So again, this sort of surrealist element here, where it's a poem that doesn't entirely make literal sense, but it's got the sort of dream logic of the fantasy, right? Fantastic elements. A giant hand reaching around someone, this uncertain, unclear relationship to firing a gun, etc., etc. Again, this is stuff that was very, very striking and challenging for Korean literature in the 1930s. I mean, this would have been challenging anywhere in the world, but in Europe and to a lesser extent the US, the Dadaists, the Surrealists, etc., had gotten started really a couple of decades before, and it was by the 30s that their influence started to be felt in East Asia, as well as other places in the world. That these types of poetic innovations that really arose out of World War I started to become internationalized. I'm going to read you a couple more. This one is poem number 10, Butterfly. A shred of torn wallpaper calls a dying butterfly to mind. It is a secret mouth in touch with the other world. One day I see a dying butterfly examining my beard in the mirror. The butterfly with drooping wings drinks dewdrops curdled in a warm breath. If I die pressing my hand over my mouth, the butterfly will fly away as if to stand up just after my sitting down. I'll keep this secret inside. Again, a pretty surrealist poem. And then the last one I want to read to you is poem number 11. Another surrealist poem. Poem number 11. This porcelain cup looks like my skull. When I take the cup in hand, an arm like a grafted branch sprouts from my arm, and the hand that hangs from the upstart arm snatches the porcelain cup and flings it over my shoulder to the floor. Because my arm defends the porcelain cup to the death, the broken bits of cup are, of course, my own skull that looks like the porcelain cup. Even if my arm had so much as flinched before the branching arm twisted snake-like back into my arm, the white paper holding off the flood would have been ripped. But as expected, my arm defends the porcelain cup to the final breath. So again, it's these sort of strange surrealist poems in which images function according to a dream logic rather than a sort of literally followable waking logic. It is about images that create sensations, images that create an emotive reaction of what the unconscious mind might call into being in the course of this sort of fantasy world of the unconscious mind.